Yes, I'm afraid that, of course, nuclear war or a nuclear incident is possible. Um, the risk is always present, and I think it's greater at a time of great tensions, first between the United States of the West and Russia, also with other great powers. And this is why it's so important to not be complacent about these risks, but for leaders to be attentive to them and to be doing everything they can to mitigate them so that there isn't an inadvertent, an escalation, a conflict, a miscalculation that could lead to catastrophe. So I think one of the first things is to restore the channels of dialogue, of crisis management dialogue, of strategic stability dialogue, maybe first and foremost between the United States and Russia, and a dialogue not just to air grievances on each side, but one that begins to identify mutual interest. We obviously have a mutual interest in survival and in not blowing up the world, but beyond that, how to begin to address the security concerns that each side has in a mutually beneficial way so that we can move away from the risks that we're facing today. I know a lot of experts call this period a Cold War II. I mean, it's a label. I think what that label means, of course, it's very different than the Cold War when there was a great ideological struggle between democracy and communism. It's not like that now, but the point is that there are rising and unattended tensions between great powers, as I've spoken about, between Russia and the West. There are obviously tensions with a rising China, and these relationships need to be managed carefully so that they don't spiral into a conflict, probably starting as a regional incident that could go out of control. I think we're off to a relatively good start with the extension of the New START treaty for 5 years. I think that was a really important decision, and I think it was the correct decision because we need that foundation of stability between our countries to build on. And there's a lot of work to do in terms of, first of all, frankly, already getting to work on a successor agreement to New START, because I think it's going to be very difficult and it's going to take time, and we really need to use the 5 years we have wisely. And frankly, in some senses, it's not really 5 years, it's 2 or 3 years when we have to get that work done. We also have to start addressing weapons and technologies that are outside of the scope of the current New START treaty. And some of these are going to be very difficult, things like understanding the cyber risk to nuclear command and control and seeing if we can't at least develop some norms or rules of the road about things that neither country will do, and also safeguarding our systems from third parties or third actors to prevent the use of nuclear accidents, partly as a result of nuclear weapons as a result of accident or miscalculation. And so those issues are really challenging because they don't lend themselves to the traditional arms control instruments. You're not counting things in every case. And so we need to start having those conversations and trying to get on top of understanding what technological advances mean and how policymakers can manage those advances so that they're positive more than negative. Well, for stepping back, I mean, one of the reasons that we're in such a dangerous time has been the erosion of the arms control architecture that has really, helped keep guardrails on, on conflict and competition between our countries and in Europe for decades. And the loss of the INF Treaty, or I'm sorry, the loss of the Open Skies Treaty is another evidence of that. I think it was really unfortunate that the United States withdrew from the Open Skies Treaty, and now we have Russia, as you've just said, announcing its intent to withdraw. I don't think that's something that most of the other treaty parties want to see, our allies and partners in Europe. And so I hope that we can find a way back, that Russia will change its mind. I know that the United States is looking at options. I don't know what they're going to be from a legal standpoint, because the United States has left the treaty. And so it could require another advice and consent process to join, which is very challenging politically here. But I hope that our diplomats will look at ways to retain the agreement, and I hope Russia will not follow through on its withdrawal. I think that's very challenging. I would like to see some restoration of a ban on this class of weapons in Europe, including Russia west of the Urals. And I know there's been some talk of a moratorium. The Russians have proposed that. I think, as always, the devil is in the details. You know that the United States came to the conclusion that Russia had violated that treaty by deploying a certain missile. And so that missile will have to be subject to a ban if there's ever agreement. So as I say, I think the devil is in the details, but I think it's worth exploring whether we could come to agreement on what systems won't be deployed west of the Urals. And of course, that would mean a commitment by the United States not to reintroduce this class of weapons in Europe. So that's where I would start. I don't know what can be done on a trilateral basis. The force structures and security requirements of the United States, Russia, and China are very different in each region. It's certainly worth exploring restraints. And of course, another idea that's been talked about has been, commitments to make them conventional only, which could solve part of the problem, because then they wouldn't be delivering nuclear weapons. But still, the short time of flight and precision makes them a concern, even if they're conventional. So it's a hard challenge, but I think the way to start addressing it is seeing if we can restore some stability in this area between the United States and Russia, and not go down the path we are starting down of an arms race in this class of weapons. Well, the Biden administration has said that it would like to come back into compliance or rejoin the JCPOA with Iran if Iran returns to compliance. And I just actually heard Secretary Blinken on the radio this morning saying, in addition, they want an agreement that is both, longer and stronger. So that means extending some of the timelines from the additional agreement, and presumably requiring additional commitments from each side. So I think it's going to be difficult, but I think the will is there in the United States, certainly among the other treaty partners, including Russia and Iran. And so I think we're at this delicate moment now where this diplomacy begins in terms of which actions one side or the other, will take to encourage the other to do what they need to get back into compliance. But I think it's so clearly in each country's interest and in the global interest that it's essential that we get back to the JCPOA and build on it to, frankly, prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, but also as a foundation for further stabilizing steps in the Middle East. Yeah, I think we have to think of terrorism in all its forms, and the potential for nuclear terrorism as a persistent threat that we have to remain vigilant to protect against always. I mean, terrorism is not in the forefront of the mind for many people as it was right after the 9/11 attack here. Of course, frankly, now we're having a wave of domestic terrorism, which makes you think about, well, what could happen in that regard. And so I think it's incumbent on every country that has nuclear materials, and this can also be materials for civil nuclear power, to keep those in, to guard them, to keep them safe, to make sure that they're not getting into the wrong hands. And I do think the Biden administration will put an increased emphasis back on nuclear security and nuclear material security, which, as you know, was kind of the nuclear security summits were a hallmark of the Obama administration. And I think a commitment to that issue will be more visible with the Biden administration. And it really needs to be a global effort that never stops, because terrorists never stop plotting, and we can't be one step behind them. We have to be 3 steps ahead of them. Well, I think it is having profound effects, which we probably don't fully appreciate. But one thing is, it's reminding us all of something we've really always known, which is that there are many threats that we face that are transnational. You can't stop them at your border. You can't become an isolationist nation and think that you can keep your country and your people safe. And I think specifically of the 3 kind of catastrophic threats of biological threats, as we're witnessing now, naturally occurring, but they, of course, could also be intentionally occurring, climate change and the risk of nuclear weapons. And so it's also a reminder that we have to work on a multilateral basis to address these threats. And so I hope that, a year ago, none of us thought we'd be sitting on our homes on Zoom, wearing masks when we go out, not going to our offices, even though experts were saying a pandemic was possible. And I think the same in some ways is true with the risk of nuclear use. So, we need to not find ourselves someday saying, why didn't we do more to prevent the use of a nuclear weapon? So now is the time to be acting, and to be acting cooperatively where we can with others to reduce nuclear risks. And it's particularly important to remember that as we are 6 months or so out from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, where the world will be looking at the international community to say what it's going to be doing to ensure that that regime stays healthy, that we don't have new states with nuclear weapons, and that the states with nuclear weapons really renew their commitment to their obligation to continue the disarmament process.